The neon sign of Windy City Bargains buzzed with a depressing, low-frequency hum. Inside, the air smelled of cheap plastic and stale coffee, a far cry from the sleek, marble-floored penthouse in Seoul that Ji-hoon was born to inherit. As the newly appointed heir to Korea's most notorious underworld syndicate, Ji-hoon's hands were usually stained with things much worse than cardboard dust. His family's multi-billion-dollar empire traded exclusively in the shadows. But power brought vultures. Every woman he met saw him either as a ticket to ultimate luxury or a dangerous thrill. Desperate to find someone who saw him and not the shadow of his mafia crown, he fled to Chicago, took the alias J, and ended up working a minimum-wage retail job. He was restocking a shelf of generic detergents when the bell above the door chimed. Ji-hoon looked up, and for the first time in his life, his heart entirely skipped a beat. Her name was Amarachi. She walked into the break room later that morning wearing the same faded blue employee vest, looking entirely out of place, yet completely mesmerizing. Back in Nigeria, Amarachi was the sole heir to a massive oil and shipping conglomerate. She had spent her life dodging old, power-hungry billionaires. Her father tried to arrange for her to marry. "I am not a business transaction," she had fiercely told her father before packing a single suitcase. "Give me time. I will find a man who loves me for me, without your money or your influence." Now she was Amy, a cashier in a gritty Chicago neighborhood, renting a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment down the street. Survival in retail was a bonding experience. From day one, Ji-hoon found himself constantly watching over her. As the weeks bled into months, their polite nods turned into shared jokes over lunch breaks, which turned into deep, late-night conversations as they walked home together in the biting Chicago cold. To Amarachi, Jay was a sweet, slightly reserved guy who was incredibly protective and surprisingly disciplined for a salesperson. To Ji-hoon, Amy was a fierce, brilliantly intelligent woman whose laugh could instantly erase the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. They were both living paycheck to paycheck, pretending to stress over grocery budgets while secretly possessing enough wealth to buy the entire block. Then came the day everything changed. A notorious local troublemaker and his crew walked into the shop looking to causing trouble. He stormed up to Amarachi's register, slamming a broken item on the counter and screaming in her face, hurling insults and demanding cash. Amarachi stood her ground, her eyes flashing with a regal fury, but the man escalated, reaching across the counter to grab her arm. He never made contact. Before the customer could blink, Ji-hoon was there. The mild-mannered salesman vanished. With the terrifying, calculated precision of a mafia boss, Ji-hoon grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it until the bone audibly popped and slammed his face into the counter. He didn't yell. He just leaned in and whispered something in a tone so cold it drained the blood from the man's face. The crew grabbed their groaning leader and fled the store. Amarachi stared at Ji-hoon, shaking, slightly not from fear of the customer, but from the sudden, intoxicating intensity of the man standing in front of her. "Are you okay?" Ji-hoon asked, his voice instantly softening back into Jay as he checked her hands. The adrenaline from the fight still hummed through the air of the empty parking lot. The police had been called by the shop manager, statements had been taken, and the store had been locked up for the night. But as Ji-hoon and Amarachi walked away from the neon glow of Windy City Bargains, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. The wind off Lake Michigan was brutal, cutting through their thin employee jackets. Amarachi wrapped her arms tightly around herself, her mind racing. For months she had seen Jay as a gentle, quiet man who carefully stacked boxes and always made sure she took her lunch breaks first. But tonight she had seen a flash of something entirely different. The way he had neutralized a man twice his size without breaking a sweat, the sheer, terrifying authority in his eyes, it should have scared her. Instead, her heart was hammering against her ribs for a completely different reason. "You're shaking," Ji-hoon said, his voice breaking the silence. He stopped beneath the amber glow of a flickering streetlight. "I'm just cold," she lied softly, looking up at him. Ji-hoon didn't hesitate. He unzipped his jacket, stepped closer, and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm, smelling of cheap laundry detergent and the distinct, comforting scent of him. As he adjusted the collar around her neck, his fingers brushed against her jawline. He froze, and so did she. At that moment, the mask Ji-hoon had worn for months began to slip. He looked down at Amarachi, and the restraint he had practiced since arriving in America completely vanished. What made him kiss her at that exact moment wasn't just the lingering rush of adrenaline. It was a sudden, overwhelming wave of vulnerability. When that customer had reached out to grab her arm earlier, Ji-hoon hadn't just felt angry. He had felt a blinding, primal terror at the thought of her being hurt. For a man who had been raised to value nothing but power and survival, realizing that a cashier from Chicago held his entire soul in her hands was terrifying. He looked into her deep brown eyes, seeing no fear of him, no greed, and no hidden agenda. He saw only her. He was tired of hiding. He needed to anchor himself to the only real thing in his universe. "Amy," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. Amarachi looked up at him, her breath hitching. In her world back in Nigeria, men approached her with practiced smiles, rehearsed compliments, and eyes that constantly calculated the value of her father's oil fields. They treated her like a prize to be won, a trophy for their own egos. But as Jay leaned in, his hand gently cupping her cheek, Amarachi felt a profound sense of reverence. His touch wasn't demanding, it was trembling. He was looking at her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in existence, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was a billionaire heir. For the first time in her life, Amarachi felt completely seen. Not for her name, not for her money, but for the girl standing under a broken streetlight in a faded blue vest. A sudden, fierce wave of affection washed over her, melting away the Chicago chill. When his lips finally met hers, the rest of the world dissolved. The kiss lasted for what felt like a beautiful, suspended eternity, a solid, unbroken 2 minutes where time entirely lost its meaning. It began with the hesitant, questioning tenderness, a soft brush of lips that asked for permission. But as Amarachi leaned into his chest, her hands gripping the front of his shirt to pull him closer, the kiss deepened into something urgent and consuming. It was a confession without words. It was Ji-hoon pouring all the loneliness of his hidden mafia life into her, and Amarachi pouring all her longing for freedom into him. The heat of his mouth against hers was intoxicating, a sharp contrast to the biting wind around them. Every breath they shared felt like a quiet pact, a recognition that whatever storm was coming, they were no longer facing it alone. When Ji-hoon finally pulled back just a fraction of an inch, their foreheads rested against each other. Their breath misted together in the freezing night air, both of them breathing heavily. Amarachi kept her eyes closed for a second longer, her fingers still tangled in his shirt, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. A brilliant, undeniable realization settled deep in her chest. She was entirely, hopelessly in love with this penniless salesman. Ji-hoon looked down at her, his thumb gently tracing her lower lip, his gaze intense and fiercely protective. From that night on, there was no turning back. The first step of their love story had been taken, sealed under a flickering Chicago streetlight, built on a foundation of beautiful, absolute lies. The mist of their shared breath had barely cleared in the freezing air when Ji-hoon's hands slid from her cheeks to her shoulders, his grip tightening with an intensity that suddenly felt heavy. The tenderness of the kiss was still burning on Amarachi's lips, but the look in his eyes had shifted. It was no longer the look of Jay, the quiet retail coworker. It was a flash of the absolute, unyielding authority he had spent his entire life inheriting. "After tonight," Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that vibrated against her chest, "there is no turning back. We are tangled forever." Amarachi's heart skipped a beat, a sudden spike of panic piercing through the warmth in her veins. Tangled forever? The word sounded too heavy, too possessive, frighteningly similar to the demands of the powerful men she had fled Nigeria to escape. She stepped back, breaking his grip, the cold Chicago wind rushing between them like a slap in the face. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice trembling as she handed his jacket back to him. "Jay, look. This was just a mistake. It was an adrenaline rush from what happened at the store. It was not meant to happen. You and I, we are just workmates." "We are not just workmates," Ji-hoon said, stepping forward, refusing to let the distance remain between them. "I've been trying to sit on this for a long time. I've tried to suppress how I feel about you, but to me, this isn't just some retail fling. It is something much bigger than that. You are it for me, Amy. You cannot be with anyone else except me." Amarachi's walls instantly slammed shut. Her pride and her deep-seated fear of being controlled flared up. "You cannot be with anyone else." To her, it sounded like a decree, an echo of the old billionaires back home who thought their money gave them the right to own her destiny. She didn't like it. She didn't like the sudden, absolute gravity he was placing on a single kiss. "Stop it," she countered, her voice hardening. "You don't get to decide that." But Ji-hoon was done hiding his heart. The fear of almost losing her to that violent customer hours ago had broken his restraint. "Listen to me," he pleaded, his hands reaching out though he kept his distance. "Since the very first day you walked into that store, my heart hasn't been my own. I have been fighting these feelings every single day, telling myself to stay away, telling myself I couldn't afford to care about anyone. But tonight, when that man laid his hands on you, I thought my world was ending. Thankfully, you're okay. But it made me realize I cannot let another moment pass without you knowing the truth of how I feel. That kiss wasn't a mistake, Amy. It was the truth. He stepped closer, his eyes fiercely earnest. Everything I am is yours. The sheer weight of his confession was too much. Amarachi felt like she was suffocating under the intensity of his gaze. She couldn't handle this, not when she was trying to find herself, not when she was hiding a massive secret of her own. "Stop!" Amarachi interrupted, raising her hand to cut him off before he could say another word. "Stop. I don't want to hear any more of this." "Amy, please." I said, "Stop, Jay." Without waiting for his response, she turned on her heel and ran. She ran past the flickering streetlights, her sneakers slapping against the icy pavement, never looking back until she had slammed her apartment door shut and locked it with 3 separate turns. The next morning, the atmosphere inside Windy City Bargains was suffocatingly tense. Amarachi arrived early, immediately burying herself in work. She stayed behind the cash register, keeping her eyes glued to the scanner, deliberately avoiding the back of the store where the heavy lifting took place. She tried to create an invisible wall around herself, treating every interaction with robotic, professional coldness. But Ji-hoon refused to let the wall stand. Every time she looked up, he was there. If she needed a price check, he was already walking over with the item before she could page him. When it was time to restock the heavy soda crates near the front lanes, he quietly took the crates from her hands without a word, his fingers lingering against hers for a split second before she violently pulled away. "I can do it myself, Jay," she snapped under her breath during the afternoon rush. "I know you can," he replied calmly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an unwavering, maddening patience. "But you don't have to." By the second day, her pushing and his pulling escalated into a silent, frustrating war. Amarachi took her lunch break in the tiny, cramped break room, deliberately picking a time she knew he wasn't scheduled for. She sat at the plastic table, staring at a container of leftover rice, trying to convince herself that she had done the right thing. The door clicked open. Ji-hoon walked in. Amarachi immediately stood up, grabbing her container. "I'm done anyway." As she tried to brush past him to reach the door, Ji-hoon stepped into her path, blocking the exit. He didn't touch her, but his presence filled the small room entirely. "How long are we going to do this, Amy?" he asked softly, his voice carrying that same terrifyingly steady tone from the night of the fight. "You can push me away all you want. You can run to your apartment, but I am not going anywhere." "Move, Jay," she whispered, refusing to look up at him because she knew if she did, she would remember the warmth of his mouth against hers. "We are here to work, nothing else." "You're lying to yourself," he said, stepping just an inch closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You felt it too. You can be as angry as you want, but don't look at me like I'm a stranger." Amarachi felt her temper flare, masking the sheer panic of how deeply he was affecting her. She jammed her elbow forward, forcing him to take a step back, and ripped the break room door open. "We are strangers," she lied fiercely over her shoulder, "and I want you to keep your distance." She marched back out to the sales floor, her heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She had successfully pushed him away for now, but as she looked back and saw him standing in the doorway, watching her with a calm, predatory certainty, she knew the truth. Ji-hoon wasn't giving up. and the dangerous magnetic pull between them was only getting tighter. The silent warfare in the grocery aisles did not drive Amarachi away. Instead, it did the exact opposite. Every time she pushed Jay, he anchored himself firmer. Every time she ran, he stood his ground. Back in Nigeria, if a man was rejected, his pride would flare, or he would try to use his status to buy her compliance. But Jay had no status here. He had no money, yet he was willing to give the only thing he possessed, his time, his pride, and his unwavering presence, just to prove he wasn't going anywhere. Deep down, Amarachi's heart was melting. This was the raw, unvarnished, true love she had crossed an ocean to find. There were nights when he would walk to her drafty apartment building, standing outside the front gate in the biting Chicago wind. He would knock gently, calling her name. Amarachi would stand right behind the heavy wooden door, her breath hitched, refusing to open it. Yet, through the peephole, she would watch him. He would stay there for a long time, just lingering in the cold, hoping for a mere glimpse of her before finally walking away. Her heart ached to open the door, but her fear kept it locked. Until the day she couldn't make it to work. When Amarachi didn't report for her morning shift, a cold dread seized Ji-hoon. The store manager casually mentioned she had called in sick. Instantly, the Korean Mafia boss inside him overrode the retail worker. He dropped his pricing gun, walked straight out of the store, and rushed to her apartment. He knocked fiercely. "Amy, open the door, it's Jay." Inside, Amarachi was curled into a tight ball beneath her blankets, sweating and groaning in agony. She wasn't sick with a virus. She was suffering from severe monthly period cramps that left her completely paralyzed with stomach pain, unable to even stand up to cook a meal. "Jay, go away," she groaned weakly, her voice barely carrying through the door. "I'm fine." Ji-hoon wasn't a man who accepted locked doors. Recognizing the genuine distress in her voice, he didn't wait. He slipped a thin plastic loyalty card from his wallet, slid it skillfully into the ancient lock of her apartment door, and with a practiced criminal ease, clicked the deadbolt open. Amarachi gasped as he burst into the room, but her anger vanished when she saw the sheer, frantic worry in his eyes. The next 3 days became the turning point of her life. Ji-hoon didn't question her. He took one look at her, holding her stomach, understood, and immediately went to work. He boiled water, filling a makeshift hot water bottle to soothe her cramps. He went to the kitchen and used his limited ingredients to cook a warm, nourishing soup, gently feeding her spoonful by spoonful when she was too weak to sit up. For 3 straight days, he lived a double life just for her. He would go to the store to work his shift, and the moment it ended, he would rush straight back to her apartment to clean, cook, and sit by her bedside until she fell asleep. Looking at this man who thought he was poor, who had every reason to be tired after a long shift tending to her with such fierce, gentle devotion, Amarachi's defenses completely shattered. She was hopelessly, deeply in love with him. A week later, the Chicago winter had settled deeply into the streets. Amarachi was walking back from a late-night run to a local supermarket, a plastic bag of groceries in her hand. The street was dimly lit, the shadows long and menacing. Suddenly, 3 local street thieves stepped out from an alley, blocking her path. "Hand over the bag and the purse, sweetheart," one hissed, flashing a small pocket knife. Amarachi backed away, her heart leaping into her throat. But before she could even scream, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind them. Ji-hoon materialized like a ghost. The violence that followed was swift, brutal, and utterly silent. He caught the first thief by the throat, slamming him into the brick wall. When the second swung at him, Ji-hoon dodged effortlessly, breaking the man's arm with a terrifyingly clean strike, while sending the third scrambling away in pure terror. Within 30 seconds, the alley was empty again. Amarachi stood frozen, her eyes wide. She hadn't even called him. How did he know she was on this specific street? The question ran wild in her mind. Was he following me? Does he love me that much to be watching over me every single second I'm alone? Ji-hoon didn't give her a chance to ask. His face relaxed back into the gentle expression of Jae as he walked her all the way to her doorstep. When they reached her door, Ji-hoon turned to leave, but Amarachi reached out, her fingers catching his wrist. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Come inside. Let's just watch a movie together." The atmosphere inside the small apartment was warm. The scent of freshly popped popcorn and the sweet aroma of spiced drinks filled the air, cutting through the winter chill outside. They sat together on the small, worn-out sofa, a single blanket draped over both of their laps as a mindless movie flickered on the television screen. But neither of them was watching the screen. As the minutes passed, they drifted closer, the space between them evaporating until her shoulder was resting against his chest. Ji-hoon turned his head to look at her, and Amarachi looked up. The eye contact became instantly, suffocatingly intense. The dim light from the television danced across the sharp angles of Ji-hoon's jaw and softened into the deep warmth of Amarachi's eyes. There were no words, no walls, and no pretenses left. The air between them felt charged, heavy with the weight of everything they had been fighting for weeks. Ji-hoon leaned down and Amarachi tilted her face upward, meeting him halfway. The kiss was entirely different from the first one under the streetlight. This wasn't a shocked outburst of adrenaline. It was a deeply deliberate, consuming surrender. His lips met hers with a desperate, heavy hunger, molding against hers as if he were drinking in her very air. Amarachi let out a soft sigh into his mouth, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him down until the space between their bodies completely ceased to exist. The kiss deepened, becoming an intense, breathless rhythm. Ji-hoon's fingers tangled in her hair, holding her close, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind her ear. Every brush of his lips tasted like the warmth of the room, the cinnamon in their drinks, and the months of agonizing restraint they had both endured. Tea was a beautiful, overwhelming meltdown of all their doubts. When their lips finally parted, their breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. Ji-hoon didn't pull away. He kept his forehead pressed against hers, his eyes closed as his hands trembled slightly against her neck. "Amarachi." "I'm tired," Ji-hoon confessed, using her full name for the very first time, his voice breaking with raw vulnerability. "My heart is failing me. I can't take this distance anymore. Please, let's break this distance between us. I can't breathe when you're not near me." Tears pricked the corners of Amarachi's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of absolute relief. She cupped his face in her hands, looking into the eyes of the man she believed was a poor, beautiful soul. "Truly," You have turned me to love you, Jay, she whispered, her voice trembling with the confession of her own. With all the good things you have done for me, your presence made me fall so hard for you. I don't want the distance either. I am yours. They held each other tightly in the quiet apartment, completely unaware that their beautiful, perfect love was built on the dangerous fault lines of two multi-billion-dollar empires waiting to collide. For 6 glorious months, Chicago became a playground of simple, unadulterated bliss. Stripped of their titles, their money, and the suffocating expectations of their empires, Ji-hoon and Amarachi lived a life of pure, beautiful romance. They didn't need 5-star Michelin restaurants or private yachts to be happy. Their love thrived in the ordinary. They spent their free Sundays exploring the city like standard, starry-eyed lovers. They frequented the green expanses of Millennium Park, laughing as they tried to take distorted couple photos in the reflection of the Cloud Gate sculpture. On rainy afternoons, they would hide away in the dusty aisles of second-hand bookstores in Wicker Park, sharing a single cup of cheap coffee while Ji-hoon translated old Korean poems for her, his voice low and mesmerizing. They took a weekend trip to Navy Pier, riding the giant Ferris wheel at twilight. As the wheel reached its peak, suspending them high above the glittering Chicago skyline and the vast, dark expanse of Lake Michigan, Amarachi had leaned her head against his shoulder. Ji-hoon wrapped his arms tightly around her, kissing the top of her head, feeling a profound peace he had never known in the blood-soaked boardrooms of Seoul. Yet beneath the radiant joy of their romance, a silent, corrosive fear was eating away at both of them. It was a ticking time bomb buried deep under the popcorn nights and the handheld strolls. Every time they calculated their grocery budget together, a knot of guilt tightened in Amarachi's stomach. How do I tell this sweet, hardworking man that I own more wealth than this entire neighborhood will see in a lifetime? Will he think I was mocking his poverty? Will his pride break? She dreaded the thought of losing the pure way he looked at her. Ji-hoon's internal torment was even darker. Every time he looked at her innocent, radiant smile, his conscience clawed at him. She loves Jay the salesman. How can I tell her that my real hands are stained with the violence of the underworld? If she knows I am the heir to a deadly mafia syndicate, she will look at me with horror. She will run, and this time, I won't be able to bring her back. They were 2 billionaires desperately pretending to be beggars, terrified that the truth would shatter the only real love they had ever found. The collision of their 2 worlds happened on a crisp, foggy Tuesday evening. Ji-hoon had saved up 3 weeks of his retail paycheck to treat Amarachi to a nice dinner at a quiet, glass-fronted bistro overlooking a secluded section of the Lake Michigan waterfront. Amarachi wore a simple, elegant emerald dress she had bought from a thrift shop, though her natural elegance made it look like haute couture. Ji-hoon couldn't take his eyes off her. Throughout dinner, they laughed, toasted with cheap house wine, and spoke of a future together, building a life, saving up for a small house, entirely independent of the empires they had left behind. After dinner, they walked down to the deserted, misty boardwalk. The waves crashed rhythmically against concrete barriers. Ji-hoon stopped her, pulling her close by the waist, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I've never been happier than I am right now, Amy," he whispered, his eyes filled with a fierce, heavy devotion. "Me too, Jay," she replied, her heart swelling. though the familiar pang of guilt struck her chest. I have to tell him the truth soon, she thought. I have to. She never got the chance. The heavy thud of multiple car doors slamming shut echoed through the foggy air. Before Ji-hoon could react, 5 men emerged from the mist, cutting off both sides of the boardwalk. They weren't the petty street thieves from the neighborhood. These men were dressed in dark, tactical jackets, their faces grim, and their hands holding heavy steel pipes and suppressed pistols. Ji-hoon instantly pushed Amarachi behind his back, his entire posture changing in a fraction of a second. The gentle warmth of Jae evaporated. His eyes turned into chips of absolute ice. The young master of the Chang syndicate, the lead assassin, sneered in Korean, stepping forward. Did you really think hiding in a filthy American retail shop would protect you? Your father is weak, and the rival clans want your head to seal the new order. Amarachi's breath hitched. She didn't understand the Korean words, but she understood the deadly aura of the men. Jae, what is happening? Who are they? Amy, stay behind me. Close your eyes, Ji-hoon commanded, his voice dropping into a chilling, authoritative tone she had never heard before. The lead man lunged, swinging a steel pipe directly at Ji-hoon's head. What happened next shattered Amarachi's reality entirely. Ji-hoon didn't flinch. He stepped into the swing, catching the man's wrist with blinding speed. With a sickening crack, he broke the attacker's arm, stripped the pipe from his grip, and in a single, fluid, lethal motion, spun and slammed the heavy iron into the chest of a second attacker, sending him flying over the railing into the freezing lake. He moved like a demon trained exclusively for slaughter. He parried, struck, and neutralized. When a third man drew a gun, Ji-hoon threw the steel pipe with lethal accuracy, fracturing the man's collarbone before rushing forward, grabbing the gun mid-air and leveling it at the remaining assassins. If you move, you die, Ji-hoon growled in English, his voice dripping with bloodlust, his face spattered with a drop of blood from the encounter. He stood over the groaning men, a terrifying king of shadows. Amarachi backed away, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute betrayal. The man standing in front of her wasn't a salesman. He wasn't the gentle soul who had fed her soup when she was sick. He was a cold-blooded killer. Jae? Her voice cracked, trembling violently. What? What are you? Before Ji-hoon could drop the weapon and explain, the blinding headlights of 3 luxury black SUVs cut through the fog, screeching to a halt on the pavement above the boardwalk. Heavy footsteps descended. A dozen men in immaculate, tailored 3-piece suits rushed down the steps. Leading them was an elderly, sharp-eyed Korean man who stepped forward and bowed at a perfect 90-degree angle to Ji-hoon. "Young master," the old man declared loudly, his voice echoing over the waves. "We apologize for our delay. The elders have tracked the assassins. The main family in Seoul has secured the borders. Your empire is safe, Heir King. It is time to stop playing this game and return to take your throne." Jae-hoon stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, his secret identity stripped raw and bare under the harsh headlights. He slowly turned around to look at Amarachi. The disappointment, shock, and profound hurt in her eyes broke his heart into a million pieces. The illusion was gone. The mirror was broken. The dangerous truth of who he really was had finally caught up to them. The roaring waves of Lake Michigan felt distant compared to the deafening silence that crashed between them. Amarachi stood paralyzed under the glaring headlights of the luxury SUVs. She looked at the blood on Ji-hoon's face, then at the men in tailored suits bowing to him like a king. The man she loved wasn't a struggling salesman trying to build a humble life with her. He was a monster, a lie, the heir to a lethal underworld syndicate. A wave of profound sadness mixed with an overwhelming sense of foolishness washed over her. She had given her heart to a ghost. The gentle hands that had cooked her soup were the same hands that had just broken a man's bones without a flicker of remorse. "Amy, please let me explain," Ji-hoon pleaded, dropping the gun. The cold authority in his voice vanished, replaced by the desperate panic of Jae. He took a step toward her, reaching out. "Don't touch me," Amarachi screamed, her voice cracking with raw heartbreak. Tears finally spilled over her cheeks. "Don't you dare come near me." Turning on her heel, she fled into the foggy night. She ran blindly, her thrifted emerald dress tearing slightly as she sprinted away from the boardwalk, away from the black SUVs, and away from the man who had shattered her heart. Jae-hoon didn't care about his guards or the rival assassins groaning on the concrete. He ran after her. He kept his distance so as not to terrify her further, but he followed her all the way back to her cramped apartment building. When Amarachi slammed her wooden door shut and threw the heavy deadbolt, she collapsed against it, sobbing uncontrollably. Within seconds, the heavy, frantic knocking began. "Amy, please open the door," Ji-hoon's voice begged from the hallway. He pounded against the wood, his forehead resting against the frame. "I lied to you, yes, but the love was real. Everything I felt for you was real. I only hid it because I was terrified you would look at me exactly the way you are looking at me right now." Inside, Amarachi covered her ears, refusing to speak, refusing to breathe. The disappointment was too heavy. She felt entirely cheated. How could she ever trust a man whose entire existence was a fabrication? For an hour, Jae-hoon stayed out there, knocking intermittently, his heart breaking in the dim hallway. Then the heavy silence of the apartment building was shattered by the booming sound of elevator doors throwing open. Menacing, heavy footsteps marched down the narrow corridor. Suddenly, a violent, booming crash rattled the entire apartment frame. Someone was pounding on Amarachi's door with a force that threatened to splinter the wood. "Amarachi!" A commanding, thundering voice echoed through the hallway. "Open this door immediately. I know you are in there." Inside, Amarachi's breath hitched. Her blood ran cold. She recognized that voice instantly. It was her father, Chief Abena, the billionaire oil tycoon, all the way from Lagos, Nigeria. Outside, Jae-hoon spun around, his mafia instincts immediately putting him on high alert. He found himself facing 4 massive, stone-faced Nigerian bodyguards dressed in expensive tactical suits. In the center stood an older, distinguished Nigerian man in a rich, flowing agbada, staring at the door with absolute fury. "Who are you?" Ji-hoon growled, his hand instinctively tracking toward his waistband, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Chief Abena didn't even look at him. He slammed his fist against the door again. "Amarachi, if you do not open this door this instant, my men will take it off its hinges. Your little vacation of playing a peasant is over." The sound of her father's voice, combined with the threat of violence in her sanctuary, forced Amarachi's hand. Trembling, she unlocked the 3 deadbolts and pulled the door open. The moment the door swung open, the hallway became a theater of absolute shock. Jihoon froze, his jaw tightening as he looked at Amarachi. She wasn't wearing her faded blue employee vest. She stood tall, her posture instantly shifting into that of a royal heir as she faced her father, even with tears staining her face. "Father," Amarachi whispered, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" Jihoon was completely astonished. His mind raced, trying to process the words he had just heard. Playing a peasant? Father? He looked at the entourage of international security guards, the sheer aura of extreme wealth radiating from the older man. Amarachi turned her eyes to Jihoon. In that agonizing second, she couldn't say a single word of defense. The anger she had held against him just moments ago died in her throat, replaced by a paralyzing wave of mutual exposure. Her own massive secret was laid entirely bare under the flickering hallway lights. Chief Abana stepped between them, finally glancing at Jihoon with deep disdain. "Is this the ordinary man you ran away to America for, Amarachi? A boy in a faded retail jacket?" "Father, stop," Amarachi whispered, her eyes locked on Jihoon's shocked, heartbroken face. Jihoon let out a hollow, bitter laugh. The irony of the situation cut deeper than any knife. He had spent months agonizing over how to tell his poor girlfriend that he was a billionaire mafia boss, only to find out she was a billionaire princess who had been playing the exact same game. "An empire," Jihoon muttered softly, staring at her. "You lied to me too." "Jay, I wanted someone to love me for me," she pleaded weakly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "And I wanted the same thing," Jihoon said, his voice dropping all its warmth, turning completely dead and hollow. "But it seems neither of us exists." The revelation didn't bring them together. It tore them completely apart. The disappointment was a mutual, suffocating weight. The pure, beautiful oasis they had built in Chicago was completely poised. Every shared budget, every cheap diner date, every sacrifice they thought they were making for each other felt like a cruel, twisted joke. Jihoon took a slow step back, his face hardening into the mask of Air Kung. He looked at her one last time, not as Jay, but as the future leader of the underworld. "Your father is right," Jihoon said coldly, his eyes devoid of the light she had fallen for. "The game is over." Without another word, Jihoon turned on his heel and walked down the hallway, his steps heavy and echoing. He walked past her father's bodyguards, dialed his own security detail, and prepared to board a private flight back to Seoul. Amarachi watched him leave, her heart breaking into a million jagged pieces. She didn't fight her father as his bodyguards began packing her single suitcase. She allowed herself to be led down to the waiting Mercedes, her eyes staring blankly at the dark Chicago streets. They went their separate ways, entirely broken and profoundly disappointed. They had both found the truest, most beautiful love of their lives, only to realize that the people they fell in love with were nothing more than a beautiful lie. The retail workers were dead. Only the dangerous heirs remained, separated by oceans, pride, and the crushing weight of their true identities. For 8 agonizing months, the separation was a living death. In Seoul, Jihoon had officially ascended to the throne of the Chang syndicate. He sat at the head of massive boardroom tables, surrounded by dangerous men who feared him. Wearing impeccable three-piece suits that felt like a straitjacket, he had all the power he had ever been promised, but his soul was hollow. Every luxury penthouse view reminded him of a drafty one-bedroom apartment in Chicago. Every glass of expensive whiskey tasted bitter compared to the cheap spiced drinks they used to share. In Lagos, Amarachi was drowning in the opulent prison of her family's corporate empire. She was brilliant, managing multi-million-dollar shipping lines, but she moved through her days like a ghost. Her father no longer paraded old billionaires in front of her. She had proven her competence, but the victory felt completely empty. Both of them were trapped in the exact wealth they had tried so hard to escape. But more than the wealth, it was the burning memory of their final night in Chicago that tortured them. The anger had long since cooled, leaving behind a profound, aching realization. They had both lied for the exact same reason. They were two halves of the same scarred coin, running from a world that wanted to consume them, desperate to be loved for who they were underneath the gold and the blood. It was Jae-hoon who took the first step. The turning point came during a brutal restructuring of his syndicate's shipping assets. As he looked over an international maritime map, his eyes caught the name of an elite Nigerian conglomerate managing the Atlantic Port Sabina Global Holdings. Jae-hoon stared at the logo, and his heart did that violent, erratic skip it hadn't done in 8 months. He realized something that changed everything. When I was Jay, I loved a girl who made $12 an hour because she was fierce, kind, and brilliant. When she was Amy, she loved a penniless salesman who had nothing to offer but his protection. We didn't fall in love with the masks. We fell in love with what was underneath. He was a mafia boss. He was used to taking what he wanted by force, but for the first time in his life, he humbled himself. He didn't send an army. He sent a formal, high-level diplomatic invitation from the Kang syndicate to the Obina family for an exclusive, private summit in London, a neutral ground. The meeting took place in the glass-walled conservatory of a private estate in London, surrounded by the quiet patter of a British rain. Amarachi arrived first, flanked by her father's top security detail. She wore a stunning, tailored white power suit, her hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the ruthless corporate queen. Yet, her hands were trembling inside her pockets. The heavy oak doors opened. Jae-hoon walked in. He had dismissed his guards. He wore a dark, elegant overcoat, his hair swept back, his dark eyes carrying the heavy, commanding gravity of a syndicate king. But the moment his gaze locked onto Amarachi, the king vanished. His eyes softened into an agonizing, familiar vulnerability. The silence between them stretched, thick with 8 months of unspilled tears, unspoken apologies, and a longing so intense it was suffocating. "You look beautiful, Amarachi," Jae-hoon said softly, his voice cracking slightly on her real name. "And you look like a man who doesn't belong in a retail vest," she replied, a faint, watery smile breaking through her defensive exterior. Jae-hoon closed the distance between them, ignoring the protocols, ignoring the corporate tables. He stopped just inches away from her. "I'm not here to negotiate shipping lines, Amy. I'm here because I can't breathe anymore. I spent my whole life looking for someone who saw me. I found her. And then I threw her away because I was too proud to realize she was just as terrified of the world as I was." Tears blurred Amarachi's vision. The corporate mask she had meticulously built in Lagos completely shattered. "You broke my heart, Jay. I thought you were a gentle soul." "I am gentle," Ji-hoon whispered, stepping closer, his hands rising but hovering just above her waist, asking for permission. "Only with you. Only ever with you. I lied to protect a dream." "I am sorry." "I lied too," she cried softly, reaching out and grabbing the lapels of his expensive coat, pulling him closer. "I was so angry at you for lying, but I was doing the exact same thing. I was just so scared you would look at my money and stop seeing me." "Never," Ji-hoon vowed. His arms finally wrapped around her waist, crushing her against his chest as his mouth found hers. The reconciliation kiss was an explosion of pure, unfiltered emotion. It carried the weight of their grief, the frustration of their separation, and the absolute certainty that they belonged together. It was fierce, desperate, and deeply reassuring. Ji-hoon held her as if she were a lifeline pulling him out of a dark ocean, and Amarachi clung to him, finally finding her home again in the middle of a London rain. When they finally broke apart, they didn't talk about returning to their old retail jobs. They were realists now. They understood that you cannot run away from destiny. You have to conquer it. Right there in London, they formulated a master plan for a future that would shock the global financial and underworld landscapes. They decided to merge their lives, their hearts, and their multi-billion-dollar empires into a single, unprecedented global superpower. The alliance was legendary. Amarachi's shipping and oil conglomerate provided a legitimate, massive global infrastructure, while Ji-hoon's syndicate provided the ironclad, untouchable security and intelligence network that protected their assets across Asia and Africa. But more importantly, together, they began a massive, systematic cleanup of the Kang syndicate. With Amarachi's brilliant legal and corporate mind guiding him, Ji-hoon systematically dismantled the illegitimate, dangerous, illicit trades of his family's past, transforming the syndicate into a legitimate global security and technology powerhouse. They became the ultimate power couple, ruthless to their enemies but profoundly devoted to each other. 2 years later, they returned to Chicago for one weekend. They didn't stay in a 5-star hotel. Instead, Ji-hoon used a fraction of his wealth to buy the entire apartment building where they used to live. They walked down the same dimly lit street, holding hands, wearing expensive coats, but feeling like the same 2 retail workers who had fallen in love under a broken streetlight. They looked up at the flickering neon sign of Windy City Bargains in the distance, smiling. Their love story had begun in a beautiful lie, but it had forged a reality that was entirely, beautifully bulletproof. 2 completely different empires, built on a foundation of beautiful lies. But when the masks came off, their true love became an unstoppable global superpower. If you believe that true love can survive the darkest shadows, smash that like button right now. Don't let their story end here. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next high-stakes, cinematic romance drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have forgiven the lies? Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video.